Despite recording 75 albums and being crowned the Crown Prince of Reggae, Dennis Brown died at 42 with shredded lungs and empty pockets. The music industry treated him like a tireless money-printing machine, while his hometown Ghetto used him as a free ATM. Crushed by corporate greed and his own brothers, he turned to drugs to survive, only to be bled completely dry. But the trap that killed Dennis Brown was set long before fame. We have to rewind the tape back to the late 1960s in Kingston, Jamaica. The island had only recently gained independence from Britain in 1962, and it was a place of extreme contrasts. There were lush resorts for the wealthy and sprawling zinc-fenced ghettos for the poor. In neighborhoods like Chisholm Avenue, where Dennis Emmanuel Brown was born in 1957, survival was a daily grind. Poverty was not just an economic condition. It was a physical weight, but the ghetto had an escape valve, a heartbeat that pulsed through the concrete. The sound system culture. Massive walls of speakers were set up in open-air lawns, vibrating with the heavy bass of ska and rock steady. This was the local radio, the local newspaper, and the local religion all rolled into one. For a young boy in Kingston, the men who controlled the sound systems and the singers who voiced the dub plates were gods. And Dennis Brown, even as a small child, knew he wanted to be among them. He was not just a kid who liked to sing in the shower. Dennis was a prodigy. He had a voice that defied his age, rich, textured, and dripping with an emotive soul that usually takes decades of heartbreak to cultivate. He was performing at local school concerts and neighborhood talent shows before he was even 10 years old, standing on boxes just to reach the microphone. He caught the attention of local musicians, including Byron Lee of the Dragonaires, who put the young boy on stage. But performing for applause is one thing. Entering the machinery of the Jamaican recording industry is entirely another. The local music business in the late 1960s was not a place of corporate polish or artist development. It was an industrial sweatshop operating out of cramped, smoke-filled rooms on Orange Street, the beating heart of Kingston's music scene. It was a fiercely competitive, unregulated frontier. Producers were essentially street hustlers who had managed to buy recording equipment. They needed content, and they needed it fast to feed the insatiable appetite of the local sound systems. Dennis Brown was shoved into the vocal booth at Studio One when he was just 11 years old. Studio One, run by the legendary Clement Coxsone Dodd, was the Motown of Jamaica. It was a hit factory, but it was also a place where grown men fought, smoked heavily, and conducted business with ruthless efficiency. There were no child labor laws protecting young entertainers in Jamaica at the time. There were no social workers ensuring a boy went to school, ate a balanced meal, or got 8 hours of sleep. There was only the microphone, the rhythm track, and the heavy expectation of the men in the control room. Coxsone Dodd was an incredibly shrewd businessman. When he heard Dennis sing, he didn't just hear a talented kid, he heard a highly lucrative, once-in-a-generation commodity. Dodd understood that a voice like that, wrapped in the innocent, smiling frame of a child, would be irresistible to the Jamaican public. But a studio is no place to raise a boy. They isolated him from normal childhood experiences, forcing him to work adult hours in these high-pressure environments. He was surrounded by hardened session musicians, older singers, and businessmen who viewed him not as a child to be protected, but as an asset to be utilized. Imagine being 11 years old. Your brain is still developing. Your understanding of the world is based entirely on seeking approval from the adults around you. When the adults in your life are ruthless record producers, the conditioning you receive is absolute. Dennis was conditioned from adolescence to be a submissive worker. He learned very quickly that his value as a human being, the reason these powerful men gave him attention and praise, was directly tied to his ability to step up to the microphone, sing flawlessly on the first or second take, and follow orders without asking questions. He was never taught financial literacy. He was never sat down and explained the concept of mechanical royalties, publishing splits, or intellectual property. He was taught to smile, sing, and be grateful for whatever he was given. This childhood conditioning made him the perfect, compliant victim for the exploitation that would define the rest of his life. The mechanics of this exploitation were built into the very foundation of the Jamaican music business. To comprehend how a man can record 75 albums and die with nothing, you must understand the contractual black hole of this era. The producers utilized the island's severe lack of copyright infrastructure to execute legalized theft. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, established business model. Jamaican producers operated entirely on a flat fee system. The concept was simple and entirely weighted in favor of the man with the money. Coxsone Dodd, or later producers like Winston "Niney" Holness and Joe Gibbs, would call Dennis into the studio. They would play him a backing track that the session musicians had already recorded. Dennis would write lyrics or sing a cover and lay down the vocal. For this, the producer would hand him a tiny one-time cash payment. When he was a boy, this might literally be enough money to buy a meal, a new pair of shoes, or perhaps help his parents with the week's groceries. It was cash in hand, right then and there. But in exchange for that handful of Jamaican dollars, the producers legally claimed 100% of the publishing rights, the writing credits, and the international royalties in perpetuity. Dennis Brown was signing away the rights to his own soul before he even understood what a contract was. His first major hit, "No Man is an Island," was recorded for Studio One when he was just 12 years old. The song was a massive local success. It blared from every sound system, played on every radio station, and made the young boy a household name across Jamaica. He was a star. People recognized him on the street, but the money generated by the record sales did not go into a trust fund for his future. It did not go towards his education. It went directly into the pockets of the studio boss. Dennis received his flat fee and nothing more. When the song continued to sell for years, he saw nothing. Because he had been conditioned since he was a child to accept this dynamic, he simply kept singing, assuming that hard work, constant recording, and staying in the good graces of the producers would eventually lead to fair compensation. He thought he was building a career. In reality, he was building million-dollar empires for men in tailored suits while receiving literal pocket change. This early period of his life is critical to understanding his eventual destruction. By the time Dennis was an early teenager, he was already carrying the psychological weight of an adult breadwinner. He was the golden boy of the Kingston studios, constantly in demand. He was shuffled from Studio One to other producers, everyone wanting to capitalize on the boy wonder, whose voice had matured into a deep, resonant vibrato. He missed out on the fundamental building blocks of emotional development. He didn't learn how to set boundaries because setting boundaries in the studio meant you didn't get paid your flat fee. He didn't learn how to protect himself because the people who were supposed to protect him were the ones exploiting him. He developed a deep-seated people-pleasing mentality. He wanted the producers to be happy. He wanted the fans to be happy. He wanted his family to be happy. He became a vessel into which everyone else poured their demands, and he responded the only way he knew how, by stepping up to the microphone and opening his mouth. The 1970s arrived in Jamaica not with a whisper, but with a volatile political roar. The island was fracturing under the weight of partisan violence between the two major political parties, the PNP and the JLP. The streets of Kingston became heavily polarized, and the music had to reflect the tension. The upbeat, dance-hall-ready rhythms of rocksteady morphed into something slower, heavier, and far more militant, roots reggae. The subject matter shifted abruptly from neighborhood romances to Rastafari, black liberation, and systemic oppression. Dennis Brown was no longer the child prodigy standing on a box to reach the microphone. He had grown into a teenager, and his voice had matured into a rich, buttery, deeply emotive baritone. But unlike many child stars who failed to transition into adulthood, Dennis navigated this cultural earthquake perfectly. His voice possessed an inherent, undeniable sorrow mixed with an unwavering hope, the exact emotional frequency that roots reggae required. During this era, Dennis began working with a new breed of producers, most notably Winston, Niney, The Observer, Wholeness, and Joe Gibbs. The recording sessions from this period are legendary. They were raw, visceral, and captured the absolute essence of Jamaican street culture. Tracks like Blood and Fire, Westbound Train, and Here I Come became immediate anthems. Dennis was writing and singing with a maturity that baffled older musicians. He was articulating the pain of the Kingston ghettos with a profound empathy. But as his artistry reached brilliant new heights, the financial trap laid in his childhood began to tighten its grip, evolving into a highly sophisticated international machine of theft. In the mid to late 1970s, reggae music broke out of the Caribbean basin and exploded across the Atlantic. In the United Kingdom, working-class youth, punk rockers, and skinheads embraced the heavy bass lines and rebel stance of Jamaican music. British record labels like Trojan Records and Lightning Records realized there was a massive untapped market for this sound. They wanted content, and they specifically wanted Dennis Brown. This is where the contractual black hole swallowed him whole. When a track like Money in My Pocket, produced by Joe Gibbs, was licensed for release in the UK, it was a massive commercial triumph. The song crossed over into the mainstream UK singles chart, peaking in the top 15. It was playing on BBC Radio 1. It was selling hundreds of thousands of copies on vinyl. It was generating substantial wealth in British pounds. However, the architecture of the business ensured that Dennis saw none of this back-end wealth. The British record labels did not deal with Dennis Brown directly. They dealt with the Jamaican producers who held the master tapes. The UK labels would pay hefty licensing advances and subsequent royalties to men like Gibbs or Wholeness. Those producers, relying on the fact that they had paid Dennis a flat fee of a few hundred Jamaican dollars on the day of the recording, kept 100% of the international profits. Dennis had no performing rights organization, PRO, representation. He had no entertainment lawyer auditing the British labels. He did not own his publishing. He was completely bypassed in the administrative process. He would hear his songs dominating international radio stations. He would see his name on the international charts. But he would still be standing on Orange Street in Kingston needing to figure out how to pay for his family's dinner that week. This financial reality forced Dennis into a relentless, brutal treadmill of output. If an artist today has a massive global hit, they can tour that single album for 2 years and live comfortably off the publishing royalties for a decade. Dennis Brown did not have that luxury. Because he only earned money on the day he recorded a vocal, the only way to generate a continuous income was to continuously record. To survive, he could not spend a year carefully crafting a concept record. He had to operate on a volume-based economy. He would walk into a studio, listen to a drum and bass rhythm the session players had just laid down, write a melody and lyrics on a scrap of paper, voice the track in 1 or 2 takes, collect his cash envelope, and immediately walk to another studio down the street to do it all over again. He was voicing 3, sometimes 4 tracks a day. He was hopping between producers, lending his golden voice to anyone who had the cash on hand. The physical exhaustion of this schedule was immense, but the psychological toll was even heavier. He was trapped in a paradox. He was adored globally, yet financially insecure locally. He was building an undeniable legacy, but he did not own a single brick of it. In the midst of this relentless grind, a moment occurred that would permanently alter the trajectory of his life and his mental state. Bob Marley, the undisputed global king of reggae, the man who had the backing of Chris Blackwell's Island Records and a fortress of international lawyers protecting his publishing, was asked by a journalist who his favorite singer was. Marley did not hesitate. He pointed directly at Dennis Brown. Marley officially anointed him the Crown Prince of Reggae. On the surface, this was the ultimate validation. To be recognized by the king himself as the heir apparent was an honor that cemented Dennis's status in Jamaican music history. The entire island celebrated the title. But beneath the surface, it became a crushing, unsustainable burden. Bob Marley was a militant, highly disciplined leader. He ran his band, the Wailers, with an iron fist. He demanded fair pay, he fought for his rights, and he had a ruthless corporate machine protecting his interests. Dennis Brown was the exact opposite. Dennis was gentle, non-confrontational, and pathologically eager to please. He did not have a Chris Blackwell. He had local hustlers holding his leash. The title Crown Prince meant the global industry, the media, and the Jamaican public expected Dennis to step into Marley's shoes. They expected him to be a revolutionary, global superstar, a spiritual leader, and an infallible icon. But you cannot be a global revolutionary when you are stuck on a flat-fee treadmill just to pay your rent. The expectations were massive, corporate, and international. His reality was localized, hand-to-mouth, and chaotic. The pressure to live up to the Crown Prince moniker required him to project an image of absolute success and invulnerability. He had to smile, dress impeccably, and maintain the aura of reggae royalty, all while secretly knowing his bank accounts were a fraction of what his status suggested. He could not show fatigue. He could not decline a recording session for fear of losing relevance or income. He was carrying the weight of a musical genre on his shoulders, but the ground beneath his feet was made of sand. As the 1970s closed and the 1980s dawned, Dennis Brown was navigating a paradox that would break a normal human being. He was internationally revered as reggae royalty, yet his daily existence was anchored in a suffocating hyper-local reality. To understand how the Crown Prince was bled dry, you have to look away from the recording studios of London and the main stages of European festivals. You have to look at his front gate in Kingston. In the neighborhoods where Dennis lived and moved, the socioeconomic rules were stark. Extreme poverty dictates a different kind of social contract. In the ghetto, if one person makes it out, they do not make it out alone. They are expected to become the financial safety net for everyone left behind. While other reggae artists navigated this by building high walls, moving away, or employing strict, intimidating security details to keep the public at bay, Dennis Brown did the exact opposite. He left the gates wide open. Dennis suffered from a deeply ingrained, almost pathological inability to say the word no. This was the ultimate tragic manifestation of his childhood conditioning. Because he had been raised in recording studios by demanding, powerful men, his survival mechanism was compliance. He was hardwired to please people. He wanted to see everyone around him smiling, and he was terrified of conflict or causing disappointment. This gentle, overwhelmingly generous nature is what made his voice so empathetic. But in the ruthless economy of Kingston street life, it made him the perfect target. His home essentially became a public charity. Every single morning, a line of people would form outside his property. These were not autograph hunters or screaming fans. These were desperate people with immediate critical needs. A mother needed money to pay for her child's school uniforms. A neighbor was facing eviction and needed rent money. A friend of a friend had been arrested and needed cash to pay a police fine. Another needed to bury a relative. Dennis would walk out of his front door, his pockets stuffed with the flat fee cash he had earned from a grueling vocal session the night before. He would listen to their stories, his heart breaking for each one, and he would hand out the money. $50 here, $100 there. He would continue handing out cash until his pockets were entirely empty. The cultural expectation in the ghetto was that the star must feed the neighborhood, and Dennis internalized this to a fatal degree. He developed a ghetto savior complex. He honestly believed it was his spiritual and personal duty to carry the weight of his community, but the community's appetite was bottomless. They did not see the exhaustion in his eyes. They only saw the global hit records on the radio and assumed his wealth was infinite. They ruthlessly consumed his income. He would record a brilliant track, receive a stack of Jamaican dollars, and before he even made it back inside his house, the money was gone, distributed to the crowd waiting at his gate. He was effectively a human ATM. This extreme financial parasitism forced Dennis into an inescapable corner. To keep this massive, unofficial charity afloat, he could never stop working. He could not take a month off to rest his vocal cords, because a month off meant 30 families in his neighborhood wouldn't eat. His generosity became a weapon used against him by his own environment. He was trapped by love, guilt, and the suffocating pressure to be everyone's savior. But as the 1980s began, a golden ticket seemingly floated down from the corporate heavens. The mainstream Western music industry had been watching Dennis Brown. They saw the massive underground success he was having in the UK and Europe. Major record labels were looking for the next Bob Marley, a charismatic reggae star who could be packaged and sold to millions of middle-class Americans and Europeans. In 1981, A&M Records, one of the biggest and most powerful major labels in the world, came knocking. They offered Dennis a massive international contract. This was supposed to be the turning point. This was the moment the flat-fee exploitation would end. A&M brought the promise of massive financial advances, professional global marketing, international distribution, and crucially, proper royalty accounting. For the first time in his life, Dennis was going to be treated not as a local session singer, but as a global pop star. However, the collision between the corporate boardrooms of Los Angeles and the street-level reality of Dennis Brown's life was an absolute disaster. The attempt to cross over into the mainstream Western market did not save him. It exposed the fatal chaotic flaws in his lifestyle. The executives at A&M Records expected a disciplined, highly professional artist. They were used to working with pop stars who adhered to strict schedules, worked within designated studio budgets, and followed long-term marketing plans. What they got with Dennis Brown was a severely overworked man carrying a massive, expensive, and unmanageable entourage. Because Dennis could not say no to his friends and dependents in Kingston, he simply brought them with him. When A&M flew him to London or Los Angeles to record and promote his crossover albums, he didn't arrive with just a manager and a guitarist. He arrived with dozens of hangers-on. These were people who contributed nothing to the music, but relied entirely on Dennis for their survival and their luxury. The culture clash was catastrophic. The record label executives were horrified as they watched their investment bleed out through astronomical, unauthorized expenses. The entourage lived in luxury hotels on the label's dime. They ordered endless room service, made thousands of dollars in international phone calls, and charged flights for friends back in Jamaica to the company's accounts. In the recording studio, the chaos continued. A major label operates on efficiency. Studio time costs thousands of dollars a day. But Dennis was used to the spontaneous, unstructured environment of Kingston. His A&M studio sessions became crowded parties. The environment was unfocused. While Dennis did manage to deliver brilliant music, his 1982 A&M album, Love Has Found Its Way, yielded a successful title track that charted in the UK and the US R&B charts. The corporate machine realized that the financial math simply did not work. The label could not control his chaotic recording process, and more importantly, they could not stop the massive financial leaks caused by his entourage. In the major label system, an artist's advance and all promotional costs are recoupable. This means the label pays for the hotels, the flights, and the studio time, but they deduct every single penny from the artist's future royalties. Because Dennis's entourage was spending money at a staggering rate, he was burying himself in corporate debt. Even though he was finally on a label that paid royalties, his expenses were so high that he never saw a royalty check. He was earning millions for the label, but on paper, he owed them money. The corporate executives quickly grew exhausted. They realized that Dennis Brown was not the next Bob Marley. Marley had the ruthless discipline to manage his camp and protect his business. Dennis was too gentle, too chaotic, and too weighed down by the parasites around him. After releasing a few albums, including The Prophet Rides Again, the major label experiment collapsed. A&M Records dropped him. The golden ticket was torn up. This failure was a devastating psychological blow. Dennis had been taken to the mountaintop of the mainstream music industry, shown the promised land of global superstardom, and then cast back down. He was left stranded. He was forced to return to the independent reggae circuit. He had to go back to the smoky studios of Kingston, back to the flat fee hustlers, and back to the relentless daily grind. But the situation was now significantly worse. He had tasted the high life, and more dangerously, his entourage had tasted it too. Their expectations had grown. The lines outside his gate in Kingston did not get shorter. The demands simply got more expensive. Furthermore, he now carried the heavy, unspoken industry stigma of an artist who had been given a major label shot and failed to cross over. Stripped of the major label backing, still missing out on his historic royalties, and drained of daily cash by his community, Dennis was backed into a terrifying corner. The only way to generate enough immediate cash to feed the machine he had built around himself was to take his show on the road. The studio was no longer enough. To survive the financial bleeding, he would have to subject his body to a lethal, non-stop touring schedule. The Crown Prince was about to step onto a treadmill of exhaustion from which he would never be allowed to disembark. The collapse of the A&M Records deal in the early 1980s was not just a professional disappointment for Dennis Brown. It was a financial death sentence. Returning to the independent reggae circuit meant returning to a system designed to keep him broke. Stripped of the dream of legitimate global royalties and professional management, and with a neighborhood in Kingston still treating his pockets like a public treasury, Dennis was left with only one viable method of survival. He could no longer rely on the recording studio alone to generate the massive amounts of daily cash required to feed the machine he had built. He had to take his voice directly to the people. He had to hit the road. The independent reggae touring circuit in the 1980s was not a victory lap. It was a meat grinder. Unlike the lavish, highly organized tours of Western pop and rock stars, reggae artists operated on a grueling, blue-collar level. There were no private jets, no luxury tour buses, and no strict union rules protecting a singer's physical health. Dennis was shoved into a chaotic network of independent promoters across the United Kingdom, Europe, North America, and Japan. He was performing hundreds of shows a year, leaping from cramped transit vans to cheap commercial flights, living out of suitcases in budget hotels. The physical toll this schedule demanded was staggering. A singer's instrument is entirely biological. It requires rest, hydration, and careful maintenance. Dennis received none of these. He was performing in dense, smoke-filled dance halls and poorly ventilated clubs. He would sing for hours, sweating profusely under cheap stage lights, pushing his vocal cords to the absolute limit to cut through the heavy, thumping bass lines of live sound systems. After a show, instead of resting, he would be ushered out into the freezing night air of London or New York, piled into a van, and driven through the night to the next city to do it all over again the very next evening. There was no vocal coach traveling with him. There was no medical professional monitoring his health. The men who surrounded him on the road, the managers, the booking agents, the entourage, were not there to protect him. They were there to collect. They operated on a volume-based economy just like the record producers in Kingston. If Dennis did not step onto the stage, no one got paid. Therefore, the concept of a sick day simply did not exist. If Dennis woke up with a severe throat infection, he was handed a cup of hot tea and told that the venue was already sold out. If he was running a fever, he was propped up and pushed toward the microphone. The industry viewed him as a workhorse, a biological engine that existed solely to generate ticket sales. And because of his deeply ingrained people-pleasing nature, Dennis never fought back. He never canceled a show. He would look at the promoter, look at the band members who needed their nightly wages, and he would force himself onto the stage, literally trading his physical health for their financial satisfaction. As the decade wore on, the damage to his body became undeniable. His respiratory system began to fail. He developed chronic asthma, a terrifying condition for a man whose entire livelihood depended on his breath control. His voice, once renowned for its buttery, flawless clarity, began to show the heavy grit of overuse. Yet, he adapted. He used that grit to add a new, desperate emotion to his live performances, and the crowds loved it. They cheered louder, completely unaware that they were listening to a man whose internal organs were screaming for a pause. But the physical exhaustion was only half of the nightmare. The psychological weight of this existence was what ultimately fractured his mind. Dennis Brown was a man drowning in a sea of people, yet he was profoundly, agonizingly alone. He was surrounded 24 hours a day by an entourage that he was financially supporting. He had to pay for their flights, their food, and their hotel rooms. He was the boss, the provider, the crown prince, but he had no one to confide in. He could not tell his entourage that he was exhausted because their survival depended on his perceived invincibility. He could not return to Kingston to rest because returning meant facing the daily line of desperate neighbors at his front gate. He was trapped in a state of perpetual anxiety. He was earning tens of thousands of dollars in cash at the venue doors, but the money was evaporating instantly to pay off the massive overhead of his touring circus and the debts waiting for him back in Jamaica. He was a global icon who frequently had to worry about how to pay his own utility bills. The human mind cannot sustain that level of cognitive dissonance indefinitely. It requires an escape hatch. When a person is crushed by physical agony, sleep deprivation, and the suffocating pressure of being everyone's savior, they will seek a way to numb the pain. For Dennis Brown, this desperate need for relief led to a tragic chemical transition. In the culture of roots reggae, marijuana is not considered a drug. It is a sacrament. It is an herb used for meditation, spiritual connection, and natural healing. Dennis had smoked marijuana his entire life, but marijuana is a contemplative substance. It forces you to look inward. For a man trying to escape his own reality, looking inward was the last thing he wanted to do. He did not want to meditate on his exploitation. He wanted to turn his brain completely off. He needed a substance that would provide an immediate, powerful surge of artificial stamina to get through the next grueling performance, followed by a total, numbing blackout. In the mid to late 1980s, that substance hit the streets of Kingston, London, and New York with devastating force: crack cocaine. The transition to hard drugs is the most misunderstood chapter of Dennis Brown's life. When the public hears that a reggae star became addicted to cocaine, they often imagine a hedonistic rock and roll lifestyle filled with wild parties and excess. This was not the case for Dennis. His drug use was not recreational, it was strictly medicinal. He was self-medicating. He was using a highly addictive, destructive chemical to treat the severe burnout inflicted upon him by a predatory music industry. Crack cocaine offered him a terrifyingly effective yet fleeting solution to his two biggest problems. First, it gave him a massive synthetic burst of energy. When he was physically collapsing from performing 5 nights in a row, a hit of the drug would shock his nervous system, allowing him to walk out under the stage lights and deliver the high-energy performance the promoters demanded. Second, and more importantly, it provided an emotional anesthetic. For a few brief minutes, the drug silenced the voices in his head. It made him forget the record producers who had stolen his royalties. It made him forget the 50 people waiting for rent money back in Kingston. It made him stop caring. But this chemical escape was a trap far more ruthless than any recording contract. Crack cocaine is notorious for its short, intense high and its immediate crushing come-down, which triggers a desperate craving for more. Dennis fell into this cycle with terrifying speed. The drug began to rewire his brain, hijacking his gentle, generous nature and replacing it with the singular consuming focus of an addict. The financial leaks in his life, already severe due to his ghetto savior complex, turned into a catastrophic flood. The massive amounts of cash he was handed by tour promoters were no longer just going to his entourage and his community. They were going directly to drug dealers. He would finish a sold-out show in London, receive a thick envelope of British pounds, and within hours a significant portion of that money would be incinerated in a crack pipe. This addiction completely eroded whatever small amount of leverage he had left in the music industry. An artist who is sober, sharp, and financially stable can negotiate contracts, demand audits, and walk away from bad deals. An artist who is experiencing the severe physical and psychological withdrawals of a crack cocaine addiction cannot negotiate anything. They are entirely focused on securing their next hit. Dennis Brown was transforming from an exploited worker into a literal hostage of his own biology. His handlers, the men who booked his tours and collected his fees, watched this transition happen in real time. They saw the erratic behavior. They saw the dramatic weight loss. They saw the erratic breathing and the trembling hands. But the music industry is not a rehabilitation center. To the men profiting off his voice, his addiction was not a tragedy to be treated. It was a vulnerability to be exploited. The 1990s arrived in Jamaica with a brutal synthetic thump. The musical landscape was undergoing a violent evolution. The organic, bass-heavy grooves of roots reggae that Dennis Brown had dominated were being aggressively pushed aside by the fast, computerized rhythms of digital dancehall. A new generation of younger, hungrier, and fiercely energetic DJs and singers were taking over the streets and the sound systems. For a veteran artist, this type of generational shift usually signals the time to gracefully retreat, to rely on back catalog royalties, and to tour comfortably as a legacy act. But Dennis Brown did not have a back catalog of royalties to rely on. and his Kingston neighborhood still expected him to be their financial savior. He could not retreat. He had to adapt, compete, and outwork artists half his age, all while carrying a devastating secret weight in his lungs. This era marked the darkest and most terrifying phase of the Jamaican music industry's machinery. The exploitation of Dennis Brown shifted from contractual theft in the boardroom to absolute physical subjugation on the road. The weapon used against him was no longer a flat fee contract. It was his own crippling chemical dependency. To understand the cruelty of this period, you have to look closely at the mechanics of the independent touring circuit. In a standard professional music industry, a global superstar's tour is handled by massive agencies. Contracts are signed months in advance. 50% deposits are wired into secure corporate bank accounts. And the artist arrives at the venue insulated by tour managers, security, and union representatives. If an artist is visibly sick or struggling with severe addiction, insurance policies are triggered, tours are canceled, and the singer is quietly checked into a luxury rehabilitation clinic in Malibu or Switzerland. Dennis Brown operated in a completely different universe. He was touring through a shadowy, decentralized network of independent promoters operating in the diaspora hubs of London, Toronto, New York, and Tokyo. These promoters were street-level businessmen. They dealt in cash at the door. They did not care about the long-term biological health of the performers. Their entire financial model relied on getting the artist onto the stage for 90 minutes, extracting the ticket revenue, and moving on to the next city. When Dennis Brown's addiction to crack cocaine became severe and impossible to hide, these handlers did not stage a compassionate intervention. They did not call doctors. Instead, they looked at a deeply exhausted, sick, and desperate man and realized they had stumbled upon the ultimate business leverage. A sober, clear-minded superstar can demand fair pay, audit ticket sales, and refuse to perform in substandard venues. A desperate addict suffering from the excruciating physical and psychological withdrawals of crack cocaine cannot negotiate anything. Their entire existence is narrowed down to a singular, agonizing focus: securing the next hit to stop the pain. The promoters weaponized this desperation with terrifying efficiency. They completely dismantled his traditional pay structure. Instead of paying Dennis his full, massive touring rates at the end of the night, shady promoters began handing him small incremental cash advances throughout the day. They knew exactly what this money was being used for. By handing him just enough cash to secure his drugs, but never enough to actually build wealth or secure his independence, they became his de facto enablers and wardens. The power dynamic shifted grotesquely. Dennis Brown, the crown prince of reggae, the man whose voice was revered globally, was reduced to begging for fractions of his own money in the hallways of cheap hotels and the back alleys behind concert venues. The promoters held his sickness hostage. The unspoken agreement was brutal. If you want the cash to get straight, you have to get in the van. You have to do the sound check. You have to walk onto that stage. They deliberately fed his lethal addiction to keep his booking fees at rock bottom, ensuring their profit margins remained astronomical, while the man generating the wealth literally disintegrated before their eyes. The psychological degradation of this process was profound. Dennis was a proud, deeply dignified man. He loved his fans, he loved his culture, and he was acutely aware of his royal status in the music world. To be forced into this humiliating daily hustle just to function broke his spirit. Yet, his pathological need to please everyone remained intact. Even while battling the grips of active addiction, he was still trying to provide for his entourage. This brings us to the tragic complicity of the people closest to him. Why didn't anyone in his massive traveling camp stop the bleeding? The heartbreaking reality is that his entourage had become entirely dependent on the Dennis Brown economy. The hangers-on, the childhood friends from Kingston, the unofficial managers, they all needed the tour to continue so they could get their cut of the cash, sleep in the hotel rooms, and eat the catered food. An intervention meant the music stops. If the music stops, the money train derails, and everyone gets sent back to the poverty of the ghetto. So they looked the other way. They became a wall of silence. Instead of acting as a shield to protect him from predatory promoters and drug dealers, the entourage acted as prison guards, ensuring he made it from the hotel to the venue, propping him up just enough to keep the revenue flowing. They watched him coughing, sweating, and losing dramatic amounts of weight, and they justified their inaction by telling themselves that Dennis was a grown man or that the music was keeping him alive. In reality, the machine was squeezing the final agonizing drops of profit out of a failing biological engine. The physical reality of smoking crack cocaine while operating as a professional vocalist is a biological horror story. The lungs are a singer's bellows. They are the fundamental instrument of their trade. They require pristine care, hydration, and expansion. The inhalation of harsh, superheated chemical vapor systematically scorches the respiratory tract. It damages the cilia, inflames the bronchial tubes, and severely reduces oxygen capacity. By the mid-1990s, Dennis Brown's body was visibly shutting down. The buttery, effortless baritone that had defined his youth was gone. It was replaced by a jagged, raspy, strained vocal tone. He would stand on stage, dripping with sweat, his clothes hanging loosely off a rapidly diminishing frame. He struggled to catch his breath between phrases. The long, majestic vocal holds that fans expected were cut short by involuntary gasps for air. Yet, in a cruel twist of irony, the audience often misinterpreted his physical deterioration. They heard the grit and the strain in his voice, and they equated it with deep, authentic emotional pain. They cheered louder when his voice cracked, thinking he was pouring his soul into the lyrics of suffering and ghetto life. They did not realize that the pain was not an artistic choice. It was a medical emergency happening in plain sight. They were applauding a man who was literally suffocating on stage. Despite his failing body, his work ethic remained terrifyingly absolute. He refused to be left behind by the digital dancehall revolution. He stepped into studios with modern producers like King Jammy, blending his veteran roots reggae vocals with the aggressive, fast-paced electronic beats of the 90s. He recorded hits alongside younger DJs, proving that his musical instincts were still razor-sharp. But every hour spent in the vocal booth and every night spent on stage was borrowing time he did not have from a body that was completely bankrupt. The ultimate physical warning sign arrived in the form of a catastrophic medical collapse. Years of untreated respiratory illness, heavy drug inhalation, and extreme physical exhaustion culminated in a severe pneumothorax, a collapsed lung. For any human being, a collapsed lung is a terrifying, excruciating experience. It feels like a sudden, sharp knife in the chest, followed by the agonizing inability to draw air into the body. For a professional singer, it is the equivalent of a pianist having their hands crushed. It is a career-ending injury that requires immediate hospitalization, surgery, and months of absolute silent rest. When Dennis suffered this massive internal failure, he was hospitalized. It was the universe throwing up a massive red stop sign. His body was officially refusing to operate the machinery of his career. This should have been the moment the entire operation was shut down. The tours should have been canceled for a year. He should have been placed in a long-term care facility to heal both his lungs and his neurochemistry. But the industry did not see a man who needed to heal. They saw a disruption in the supply chain. The promoters had tickets sold. The entourage had bills to pay. The neighborhood in Kingston was still waiting for their weekly handouts. The pressure did not dissipate while he lay in the hospital bed. It compounded. In a testament to the absolute ruthlessness of his environment, Dennis was not allowed to fully recover. Almost as soon as he could draw breath on his own, the whisper campaigns began. The handlers reminded him of the financial obligations. They reminded him of the fans waiting in Europe. They played on his profound guilt and his deep-seated desire to never let anyone down. Against all medical logic, against the basic instinct of human survival, Dennis Brown allowed himself to be pulled out of recovery and pushed back onto the touring treadmill. With a compromised respiratory system, a severe, untreated chemical addiction, and a community still actively draining his empty pockets, he stepped back into the blinding stage lights. He was no longer just a singer performing a concert. He was a martyr walking to the executioner's block, smiling at the crowd while his internal organs began the final irreversible process of shutting down. So he got back in the van. He flew to Europe, to North America, and to South America. The contrast between the joyous, uplifting rhythms of his music and the grim reality of his physical deterioration was stark and horrifying. Audiences were showing up to dance, to celebrate the legendary Crown Prince, completely unaware that they were watching a medical emergency unfold under the stage lights. Towards the end, he could barely stand for an entire 90-minute set. He would lean heavily against the microphone stand, using it as a physical crutch. He was sweating profusely, his skin carrying the pale, ashen tone of a body severely deprived of oxygen. The effortless, buttery vibrato that had once made Bob Marley name him the greatest singer in the world was now a ragged, desperately strained rasp. He was coughing between verses, gasping for air while the band extended the instrumental breaks, just to give him a few seconds to breathe. Yet the people standing in the wings, the men who collected the cash at the door, the hangers-on who slept in the hotel rooms he paid for, did absolutely nothing to stop the show. They watched a dying man trade the last ounces of his life force for their financial upkeep. They propped him up because a sick Dennis Brown still generated more cash than a healthy nobody. They had reduced one of the greatest musical geniuses of the 20th century to a purely biological engine, and they were determined to run it until the gears completely shattered. When his crack cocaine addiction flared up in these final years, it was no longer a secret, but it was actively accommodated by the very people who should have intervened. predatory promoters continued the ruthless practice of drip-feeding him small cash advances to secure his drugs, keeping him compliant, desperate, and cheap. He was isolated in hotel rooms, surrounded by people but profoundly, agonizingly alone. He had given his money, his talent, and his youth to the industry and his community. But in his darkest hour of physical and psychological need, there was no safety net. There was only the next sound check. The breaking point finally arrived in the early summer of 1999. Dennis had been on a grueling tour in Brazil, a country where reggae music commands massive stadium-level audiences. The heat, the humidity, and the sheer physical demand of performing for tens of thousands of people pushed his shredded respiratory system past the point of no return. He was visibly failing. He managed to return to Kingston, Jamaica, not as a conquering hero returning from a global tour, but as a man in the active stages of biological collapse. On June 30th, 1999, his body finally did what his mind had never been able to do. It said no. He was rushed to the University Hospital of the West Indies in Kingston, struggling violently to breathe. The years of untreated chronic asthma, the severe damage inflicted by heavy drug inhalation, and the absolute exhaustion of a 3-decade touring treadmill culminated in a catastrophic respiratory failure. The doctors fought to stabilize him, but the damage was too profound, too systemic. The lack of oxygen put an unbearable strain on his heart. On July 1st, 1999, Dennis Brown suffered a fatal cardiac arrest. He was only 42 years old. Think about the horrifying mathematics of that age. He was 42, yet he had been working as a professional full-time recording artist for 31 years. He had recorded an astonishing 75 studio albums. He had essentially lived 3 lifetimes of labor, stress, and exploitation before he even reached middle age. The immediate aftermath of his death was a masterclass in industry hypocrisy. A massive state-like funeral was held at the National Arena in Kingston. It lasted for hours. The very producers who had locked him into exploitative flat-fee contracts in his childhood sat in the front rows wearing expensive, tailored suits, weeping for the cameras. The politicians who had ignored the poverty of his neighborhood offered glowing eulogies. The hangers-on and the entourage who had bled his daily finances dry wailed in grief. They were mourning the man, certainly, but many were also mourning the sudden, terrifying realization that the human ATM had finally been switched off. When the dust settled and the accounts were opened, the forensic reality of his life's exploitation was laid bare for the world to see. The Crown Prince of Reggae, a man whose voice had generated untold millions of dollars, died completely, unequivocally broke. There were no hidden trust funds. There was no massive estate. He had absolutely nothing in the bank to leave to his 13 children. The system had operated with a lethal, terrifying efficiency. The record producers had used his childhood to build their vast publishing catalogs, ensuring they would profit off his voice forever. The international tour promoters had weaponized his exhaustion and addiction to keep his labor cheap on the road. And the ghetto, driven by systemic poverty and an unforgiving cultural expectation, had bled his daily wallet dry, taking whatever pennies slipped through the corporate cracks. The ultimate sickening insult came in the months immediately following his passing. As is common when a legend dies, there was a massive global surge in the sales of his music. Record stores across the UK, the US, and Japan sold out of Dennis Brown CDs. Digital licensing skyrocketed. Millions of dollars poured into the industry overnight. But because of the flat fee contracts he had signed as an uneducated child and a desperate adult, that posthumous wealth bypassed his grieving family entirely. It went straight into the bank accounts of the executives who already owned his masters. Even in death, his voice continued to build empires for the men who had worked him into the grave. Dennis Brown's life is not merely a tragic biography. It is a profound, unforgiving mirror held up to the machinery of the global entertainment business. It destroys the romanticized illusion that immense talent guarantees protection or wealth. He was the victim of a perfect storm, a predatory industry that targeted him before his brain was fully developed, a community that weaponized his generosity, and a live music circuit that held his sickness hostage for profit. He was killed by extreme financial parasitism and systemic neglect just as surely as if a weapon had been drawn. Yet despite the horrors of his exploitation, the machine could not corrupt the purity of his output. He left behind a monument of 75 albums that stand as the absolute pinnacle of reggae music. Every time you hear the opening horns of Here I Come or the deep rolling bass of Revolution, you are not just listening to a pop song. You are listening to a man who traded his life force, his breath, and his sanity to provide comfort to a world that offered him none in return. Dennis Brown gave everything he had until there was nothing left to give, proving that while the industry can steal a man's wealth and break a man's body, it can never truly own his soul.